If we could ask all the members to take their seat, and the audience as well. This hearing, Reforming the National Security Council, Efficiency and Accountability. The hearing will come to order. In recent years, there has been increasing bipartisan concern over the size and the role of the President's National Security Council. In too many cases, its traditional role of honest broker has evolved to a policy-making role. It's even undertaken secret diplomatic negotiations, and that has been done outside of Congress's view. Indeed, one observer recently wrote, "The National Security Advisor and his or her staff remain among the most influential entities in the federal bureaucracy that are not subject to direct congressional oversight." This has proven to be a problem for this committee. While concerns about the NSC aren't new, they've reached new heights, leading to current proposals before Congress to statutorily restrict the size of the NSC staff. And this is a staff that has increased from 100 persons at the start of President George Bush's presidency to reportedly over 400 people today on the NSC staff. Such a large staff sends the message that the President intends to run foreign policy and military operations out of the White House to the exclusion of the Cabinet. It also makes for more meddlers. Indeed, former Defense Secretary Gates has complained that the micromanagement of the Obama White House drove me crazy. A smaller staff would more likely empower cabinet secretaries to do what they have been selected and confirmed by the Senate to do, and that is to run their departments. More staff means more meetings and often paralysis. According to a report in the Washington Post last year, on some issues, NSC meetings of the cabinet deputies grew so repetitive that deputies stopped coming, stopped sending instead started sending assistant secretaries and below in their stead. How many hearings has this committee held on Ukraine at which State Department officials have told us that the White House is still debating Kyiv's request for heavy defense weapons? Also of concern, the profile of an NSC staffer has changed from a seasoned professional doing a stint at the White House as the capstone of their career to that of junior professionals just off the campaign trail. As one interviewed for the Atlantic Council study we will hear about today said, "This is no place for on-the-job training of bright, young, but inexperienced people, especially at the expense of the State Department." Take the President's move to normalize relations with Cuba, secretly run out of the White House by two NSC staffers. Secretary of State Kerry was not informed of these negotiations until the discussions were well underway, and State Department officials in charge of the region found out only as the negotiations were all but done. Why do we care? When the committee requested that these NSC staffers testify, we were told no and given a separation of powers excuse. But our role and the responsibility is to conduct oversight of U.S. relations with foreign nations. And if the committee can't hear directly from those most involved in these negotiations, our role and influence, and that of the American people we represent, is significantly minimalized. This morning, we will hear from several witnesses who have direct experience with the growing size and role of the President's NSC. While today's focus is about process, process is important to good policy. And we hope that our discussion will lead to recommendations for the next administration to improve the efficiency of this important body. And I now turn to the ranking member for any opening remarks from Mr. Elliott Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Ambassador Miller, Ambassador Blumenfield, Mr. Chalet, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're grateful for your time and your expertise. It's been nearly 70 years since the National Security Act created the National Security Council. Over that time, the Council has proved to be a flexible and dynamic body. Every president has shaped the NSC staff in a way that has worked best for his purposes. Congress intended for the NSC staff to serve as the President's advisory and interagency coordinated body, as the National Security Act put it, to, quote, advise, coordinate, assess, and appraise, unquote, policymakers relating to national security. Obviously, over that time, national security politics and concerns has changed as the world has changed, and the NSC has had to keep pace. As we think about how the NSC might look under future administrations, we should keep in mind lessons learned in the NSC's first 70 years. First, the selection of a national security advisor is one of the most critical appointments the President will make. This person sets the tone for the rest of the NSC and the national security agencies. The President should have full faith in the National Security Advisor as a trusted confidant, a role that Congress has supported. Secondly, the President's policy staff should be national security experts with experience managing interagency processes. Even though many of them are detailed from other parts of the government, their loyalty should be to our national security and not to any one agency or service. And thirdly, while the NSC staff should certainly be in the business of advising the President on policy and ensuring the agencies are carrying out that policy, the NSC staff itself should not be carrying out policy. That responsibility rests with the cabinet agencies with Congress's oversight. This is central to our discussion today. How do we ensure that the execution of foreign policy stays where it belongs? One common explanation is that the NSC mission creep results from the NSC staff growing too large, and the easy solution is to limit the size of the staff. I'm sympathetic to that feeling, because we don't want it to be too expensive, too large, and we don't want it to be usurping things that the State Department or the agency should do. But it's not just that. That in itself, in my opinion, is too simplistic. It fails to take into account why the staff has grown and ignores the bureaucratic demands facing the NSC. The real questions we should be asking are about the appropriate role of the NSC and how it's managed, issues that are important regardless of the size of the staff. I do want to say that I am concerned about the size of the staff, but I think these other things are at least equal of concern as well. In a certain way, the NSC was set up as a clearinghouse. 70 years ago, the cabinet agencies had relatively clear-cut missions with a minimal amount of overlap. When matters emerged that required cross-agency collaboration or trade-offs, the question went up the food chain to the NSC, and the NSC coordinated among agencies. Today, we face so many more issues that are cross-cutting and overlapping, and that often involve a whole host of cabinet agencies. Just consider the Zika virus. State Department, HHS, and the Agriculture Department all have roles to play in addressing that problem. But our civilian agencies are still essentially a stovepipe bureaucracy. So when questions emerge about one of the many complex national security issues we face, those questions still get passed up to the NSC, often leaving policy-making decisions in the White House's hands. Over time, this pattern has forced the staff to grow as well. Past attempts to create so-called czars to oversee overlapping issues have proved to be a band-aid at best, and at worst, totally ineffective. So how do we empower our agencies to deal with a modern set of challenges without having their first phone call be to the White House? How do we modernize our agencies and rethink decades-old bureaucratic structures ill-suited to the new challenges we face? We know this sort of reform is possible. We saw it succeed decades ago when the Goldwater-Nichols Act forced our military services to work together in joint commands. That law promoted collaboration and a more unified approach to military concerns. Following the same approach, we need to make it easier for the talented men and women in our cabinet agencies to collaborate and arrive at policy consensus. That way, NSC staff could get back to their original mission, advising the President on policy, seeing that policy carried out, and facilitating coordination among agencies only in those instances when it's absolutely necessary. Yet we simply cannot expect our agencies to shake off decades-old procedures and habits if Congress isn't providing them with the tools and resources they need to become effective modern organizations. It's been 15 years since Congress sent a State Department authorization to the President. I want to repeat that, 15 years since Congress sent a State Department authorization to the President. I don't think anyone on this committee on both sides of the aisle is happy about that. This committee recently marked up such legislation. It's sitting on the launch pad waiting for House leadership to say go. I think the problem that we're discussing today is one more reason that the House needs to finish its work on the bill, and I would encourage all the other national security committees to look at what needs to be done to bring their agencies into a 21st century. To our witnesses, I'm curious to hear your views on the structure of the NSC and how we can make our agencies more effective and collaborative when it comes to policy making. Again, we're grateful for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. So this morning we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. We have Ambassador David Miller. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Previously, Ambassador Miller served as the Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs at the National Security Council staff. Additionally, he served as the United States Ambassador to Zimbabwe and to Tanzania. The Honorable Lincoln Bloomfield, Ambassador Bloomfield's chairman of the board of the Stimson Center, and previously he held a series of positions in the Departments of State and Defense, including serving as the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. And we have the Honorable Derek Chollet. He is Counselor and Senior Advisor for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and previously he served as the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs at the Department of Defense. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. The members will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or any extraneous material for the record. So, Ambassador Miller, if you could please summarize your remarks. We'll begin with you.
Did I do that right, I think? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Ambassador.
We spent many interesting hearings on Africa, so it's great to be back. Ranking Member Engel, thank you, and all the members of the committee. I must say I am exceptionally pleased to see this many members of your body interested in the management of the NSC. It's an immensely serious topic. It doesn't get a lot of public discussion.
I'm going to ask you, though, Ambassador, to move your microphone right there.
Does that work? Perfect. Good. It's just a lack of practice. I'll get it. I am here today to present the Atlantic Council report, which I think you all have seen a copy of this. It is named a foundational proposal for the next administration. It was drafted over a couple years by Ambassadors Tom Pickering and Chet Crocker, myself, and Dan Levin. I suspect you know most of them and have talked with them before. The report is meant to address 2 issues. That is, what did we learn over the 60 or some interviews we conducted over 2 years? The interviews were conducted by all of us in person. We felt that the subjects that were being discussed were sensitive enough that when you interviewed former cabinet officers or national security advisors, that those doing the interviewing had to have had similar jobs, sat in the same meetings, and been subject to the same pressures. I must say that the opening comments were excellent and in many ways speak to our observations. But let me offer a few comments on the spirit of our report. We spent so much time on the NSC because if it doesn't work, it's like congestive heart failure. If the NSC is not working well, the entire executive branch foreign policy and military structure slows down and is not effectively used. And there's another point that I'd like to make at the outset, and I hope we'll make throughout the presentation, and that is this is a nonpartisan report. We looked at administrations going back for some period of time, General Scowcroft's thesis at West Point was on the Eisenhower NSC, so we go back a good ways. I am fond of describing the document as an owner's manual for the NSC. It tells you what has worked in the past, what has not worked, and it is policy neutral, if you will. It is meant to say, if you want to run an NSC in a manner that has been effective in the past, take a look at this document. Learning how to run the NSC is something that we may have lost track of. The recommendations are quite simple, and they're coincident with what you two have mentioned in your opening comments. The NSC needs to get back to its original mission of coordinating policies for the president and then ensuring that those policies are faithfully executed. The role of the National Security Advisor is absolutely critical. It is clearly, I believe, the most important presidential appointment not subject to Senate confirmation. The size of the NSC staff has, as we've all observed, grown quite large. There are a variety of reasons for that, but it is much larger than it has been historically. The NSC has struggled over time with creating a strategic planning staff that has never worked too well, and there are some issues about how to coordinate executive branch legal advice better. In the few moments I have left, the chairman had a question about why this happened. I think to a certain degree the most important factor is inertia. It has just grown. It has not been successfully checked by the Congress or by cabinet members or agency heads. There is another observation that the NSC has become inbox driven, that there are so many issues in the world that surely the president must have a position on all of them. The 24-hour news cycle, I think, is another contributing factor. We've talked to senior NSC officials who said the ability to delegate key presidential positions to departments and agencies to make public statements has not worked exceptionally well. The State Department, where I enjoyed working and am proud to have worked with the Foreign Service, is still seen as being too slow, too bureaucratic, and we all need to address that. The multidiscipline threat that you've mentioned is another issue where the NSC has stepped in and added personnel to deal with that. And finally, there is an issue that I will touch on at the end, and that is there seems to have developed a serious split in this town between politically loyal foreign policy professionals and professionals that work for the departments and agencies. I think we need to address that. Finally, and I thought your comments about the lack of an authorization bill for the State Department were bang on. There is a little reward in this town for building institutional capability in the executive branch. That's in some distinction from the private sector, where the building of institutional capability is seen as a key responsibility for a CEO. I'm over my time, but I have one last thing I would like to say. I've been out of town for a little bit, and when I came back and got involved in writing this, my friend said to me, "David, you've been gone too long. I'm in San Antonio." And the trust that was in this town when I was younger, which is some time ago, seems to have gone. And I hope this hearing is part of a step to begin to develop a more civil dialogue among those of us who may see issues differently, but we all love the country. That's it.
Ambassador Miller, that's exactly the tone we want to set, and we appreciate you being the lead witness here. Ambassador Bloomfield.
Thank you. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, thank you, members of the committee, for the honor of testifying before you today. I would like to second the remarks that both of you made, and it's clear that the issues that are covered in my prepared testimony are the same ones that you have already articulated. I really want to make 4 brief points from the standpoint of someone who does not have the most recent experience and has not served on the NSC, but in the last 35 years, I've been in the interagency in 5 different administrations. So I'm going to take a broader view. I will play the resident optimist. I think everyone who is here in this room today is here because they believe that it can be fixed, and so do I. The first point starts with the legal mandate for the NSC and the privileges that the NSC enjoys. So long as the NSC staff and the National Security Advisor are coordinating the work of the other national security agencies of government and following the legal mandate to make the tools of government more integrated and more effective, military and non-military, then they should continue to enjoy the prerogative of being the President's staff and therefore not being Senate confirmed, not being subject to testimony, not having their paperwork subject to the same oversight and public oversight that the line agencies of government have. That said, there are lines that they can cross and have in the past where these privileges come into question. One of the 2 sources that I consulted, and I applaud the effort of the Atlantic Council and its co-chairs, both of whom I greatly respect, but I have in my hand the so-called Tower Commission report, and people of a certain age will remember this big blue book that I'm holding. This was one of the 8 investigations on the Iran-Contra affair. This was done by 3 very respected statesmen, Senator John Tower, Senator Edmund Muskie, and Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft, who had previously served as President Ford's National Security Advisor. They found that the NSC advisor and staff had conducted a covert operation in transferring funds to the Nicaraguan Contras, and without relitigating the merits of the case. They issued a warning to future presidents, which I will read to you. They are warned, and members of the National Security Council and National Security Advisors, of the potential pitfalls they face, even when they're operating with what they consider the best of motives. So I think that there is a cautionary note. There may be issues where the NSC is becoming operational and setting policy rather than coordinating it, and that is, historically speaking, a problem. The second source, and the third point I want to make, has to do with the evolution of the NSC and with the privilege of the committee. I'd like to hold up a book by my late father, MIT professor of political science, Lincoln Bloomfield, who served on the NSC under his colleague Zbigniew Brzezinski for 1 year under the Carter administration, and wrote in 1982, The Foreign Policy Process, a Modern Primer, in which he reviewed 40 years of national security councils. Among the insights gained here were that technology moves only in one direction. Under the Kennedy administration, the White House Communications Agency installed equipment so that the White House could see the same diplomatic dispatches, the same military dispatches, the same intelligence reports as the other agencies, which made them more powerful and brought them into the conversation. Under the Nixon administration, they had secure facsimiles, so now the White House could send agendas and papers for discussion in the Situation Room, and Dr. Kissinger famously used this to great effect and was actually dual-hatted as Secretary of State and NSC advisor for 2 years. And so, in some ways, you can't turn the clock back to the 1970s or 80s or the 1950s, and we have to recognize this. But before we conclude, and this is my final point, that the NSC needs to be, that there's a right size, and that the President's prerogative should be in some way changed or interfered with by the Congress, I think it's really important to recognize that the NSC is trying to chase a bureaucracy in Washington that's much bigger than it was 20 or 30 years ago. There are so many more undersecretaries and assistant secretaries and issue-specific offices that they are asked to coordinate that you could understand why the size has gotten larger. And I think this leads to perhaps a broader conversation on how to right-size the entire national security process. I published last Friday in Foreign Policy an article that takes a slightly larger view of the national security management challenge, and I commend it to the members. I think copies have been made available, and with the chairman's permission and the ranking member, I would hope perhaps it could be brought into the official record of the hearing.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Cholet.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you again, and I will briefly summarize my longer statement for the record. I approach this important topic from a unique perspective. I served on President-elect Obama's NSC transition team 8 years ago, and then I went on to serve for 6 years in the Obama administration at the State Department, at the Pentagon, and at the National Security Council staff at the White House. So therefore, I followed the assessment of this administration's NSC system with great interest, since I both experienced and am partly responsible for many of the concerns that have been raised. Consider the three most common concerns expressed about the current NSC. First, that it's too big. Second, that it's too operational. And third, that it has a proclivity for too much micromanagement and too little strategic thinking. And let me take each in turn. First, most experts and former officials believe that the NSC is too big. We certainly thought so during the 2008 transition from President Bush to President Obama, as does the current NSC leadership today. And yet the trend, I think, is headed in the right direction. Today's NSC policy and leadership staff consists of fewer than 200 people. And my understanding is that with the current downsizing underway, and there's been about a 15% cut in the NSC staff since January 2015, the NSC staff size that Obama will leave next year will be roughly the same as what he inherited from President Bush in 2009. And it's important to consider these numbers in context. Some of the widely cited higher numbers of the Obama NSC staff size reflect the back office functions, like those staffing the White House Situation Room, the records management personnel, as well as the integration of the Homeland Security Council in 2009. And moreover, even despite its growth, the current NSC remains comparatively small. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is over 7 times larger. The State Department's Office of the Secretary is nearly twice the size of the NSC staff, as is the staff of the Congressional Research Service. So in many ways, the NSC's evolution reflects global complexity and how much the world and our government has changed. For example, the traditional regional policy offices, Latin America, Asia, Europe, et cetera, have looked similar in both size and function during the past several decades. Yet there are now new policy dimensions the NSC must cover, such as cybersecurity, climate change, WD proliferation, biosecurity and global health, global economics, counterterrorism. Few of these issues were prominent a quarter century ago, and none of them reside in a single agency, which is why close coordination is so important. Because of this complexity and the importance for the President to maintain flexibility in how she or he can respond to events, I believe it is a mistake to impose arbitrary caps on the NSC staff size, nor do I believe it wise to make the position of National Security Advisor require Senate confirmation. And here I can do no better than echo the 1987 Tower Commission report, which studied this issue carefully, and in its warning that doing so, making the NSC advisor Senate confirmed, would undermine the presidential advisory role the National Security Advisor must play, and only create more bureaucratic confusion and tension than it would resolve. Now, concerns about the NSC size relate directly to a second enduring critique that the NSC is too operational. Now, agencies must be given the responsibility and be held accountable for doing their jobs. And in my experience, that's what presidents and members of the NSC staff wanted. But at the same time, agencies must operate within the policy parameters set by the president. Now, sometimes when the White House tried to enforce regular order and place the agencies in charge of a policy, then it was accused of taking its eye off the ball. And where you stand often depends on whether you agree with the policy direction. For example, on behalf of the president, Obama's NSC has held tight control over U.S. troop levels in Iraq and Afghanistan. But it's important to remember that the Bush White House conducted the same intense oversight when managing the surge in Iraq from the West Wing in 2007 and 2008. Moreover, some policy issues lend themselves to a strong White House lead, and many of the most delicate tasks require such agility that they're best managed from a tight circle within the White House. Yet these must be the exception rather than the rule, which brings us to the third common critique, that by micromanaging, the NSC is not doing enough strategy. I used to run the strategy office at the NSC, so I can fully appreciate how difficult this task can be. And in today's tumultuous policy environment where a president is expected to respond to almost everything instantly, it is very difficult to keep the urgent from overwhelming the important. Crisis management tends to dominate the NSC's operations. And although during my time and since, the NSC staff worked very hard to allow senior officials the opportunity to think about long-term strategy and examine cross-cutting issues, it has not nearly been enough. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, Members of this committee, the recent focus on the NSC's design and operation has generated an important debate. I welcome congressional attention to this issue. My hope is that by opening up this conversation, we can make some necessary changes, empower agencies to do their jobs, while ensuring that the President gets the advice and support she or he requires to conduct a strong, coordinated, and strategic national security policy that serves the interests of the American people. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Cholet. I think the difficulty here, if we look at the drift, is if we look at Ambassador Miller's report, the report that we're discussing. In that report, there's the story of a 4-star general receiving a phone call with orders from a low-level NSC staffer, all right? So the directive did not originate from the President. It didn't originate from the Secretary of Defense. It didn't originate from the chairman of the Joint Chief. It originates from a rather low-level staffer. Clearly, the goal here is to get back to a system on foreign policy that works when different agencies and branches play their proper role. What we've got to figure out here is how to get a situation where diplomats do the negotiating, where commanders call in the airstrikes, where Congress conducts oversight, and that's not happening under the current and past devolution. The way in which this has morphed over the years has led to these problems that we're talking about today. And so I would just ask this question of the panel. What State Department reforms are most necessary to facilitate the devolution of power from the NSC back to the Department where the expertise lies and where you don't end up with low-level staff members making these kinds of calls to 4-star generals? How do we get back to the system the way it's intended to work and in which it will function most effectively? And Ambassador Bloomfield, maybe I'll add to that because you make the point that this has become a problem not just at the NSC, but also, you know, it's something that affects us, Congress, and the administration. We've got a situation where our instinct is to appoint a special position on everything, and so you've got all of the special envoys and all of the coordinators adding to the complexity of a situation where the agency that's supposed to be in charge of making the decision isn't doing its role. So I'll open that question to the panel.
If I may, Chairman Royce, I don't believe that the people who strategized American policy during the height of the Cold War, when we were 25 minutes from extinction from Soviet nuclear weapons, were any less intelligent than the people that we have in senior positions today. In fact, I would argue that we have too many very talented people trying to chase authority, funding, control over policy, authorship of policy. And I have many friends on the inside who have great difficulty getting a well-considered, innovative idea all the way out of the building in the State Department. And so I think that consolidating offices, and this is under both administrations, Republican and Democrat. I've spent half my career outside the government. When I've been appointed to come in, I ask the question, how much sense does this activity make? Is this something that we need to be doing, that my people should be spending time on, or are we just playing ping pong inside the bureaucracy and sending papers back and forth? So I think there's a great deal of process that can be consolidated. And what happens when you try to show how important an issue is by putting a special office in charge is that everything else becomes diluted. You dilute the currency of high-ranking people so that in the Congress you have 40-plus assistant secretaries. I was very honored to be an assistant secretary of state. If I were secretary of state today, I don't think I could name them all or recognize their faces. These are Senate confirmed.
There's another element of this, and that's part of this goes to the experience or the expertise of the staff. One of the questions in this study, the explanation from another lower-level staff member is you have a hard time running the interagency process if you have never held a senior position in one of the agencies. So this is another aspect of the problem in terms of the expertise and not consolidating this decision-making where it belongs.
If I may, at the high levels, the undersecretary level, there was one Undersecretary of State under President Kennedy. That was the second-ranking person in the department. The President would call the Undersecretary on the telephone. There are 6 or 7 today. Same in the Pentagon, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And I think, by the way, the Office of the Joint Chiefs, the combatant command staffs, I was there when they started to put joint JIACs together and was part of the approval process. They're thick with all sorts of flavors of experts on their own staffs. I think we need to downsize. And what happens is you have high officials who only have 1/7 of the picture. How strategic of a view will an administration have if everyone has just a sliver or a soda straw view of policy that they care about? We need to start elevating people and giving them a broad swath of policy authority so that they can think very strategically, and when the Zika virus becomes a problem, we can put a task force together and have it expire once the problem's under control.
Well, my time's expired, so I'll go to Mr. Engel, but it seems to me the NSC should return to its original mission of managing the development of policy options for the President of the United States. If that can be the end game here, I think we can get back to its original function and a effective function. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo my concern along with you, the two questions you asked about the role of Congress. You know, we're very anxious to, you know, many of us feel that more and more things are slipping away from what Congress is supposed to do, and we don't like it and don't think it's good for the country, so we're very concerned about it. I believe the chairman also spoke about czars, and I wanted any of you, if you care, to say that what observation would any of you make about the usefulness of these czars? The proliferation of special coordinators and special representatives at the State Department, these were created to shepherd special initiatives and to provide help with the coordination, and sometimes it's actually been an impediment to coordination. So from the perspective of the NSC, do these types of structures help or inhibit effective interagency coordination? Anyone who cares to answer that? And let me say before you do, I want to thank all three of you for excellent testimony, and Ambassador Miller, I'm glad that you couldn't have put it better when you said that if there's difference of opinion, we're all over the country, and I think that's important. The chairman and I have tried to conduct this committee as the most bipartisan committee in the Congress, because we believe that foreign policy is bipartisan and differences need to stop at the water's edge. So I just want to let you know that in the 4 years we've been doing this, we've tried very hard. Doesn't mean we agree all the time, but we've tried very hard to work together. And you know, my commendation to members, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, who have worked very hard to, even when we have a disagreement, we have a good discourse and we try to find common ground. So if anybody wants to answer that czar's question, I appreciate it. Ambassador Miller.
I ended up...
If you can pull the microphone toward you.
I ended up supporting one of... Turn on the button.
Push the button.
I'll get this in actually.
Okay.
I ended up supporting one of our first czars when Bill Bennett was given the drug war. And so I've spent a good deal of time figuring out what support from the White House is appropriate and where it is damaging. We, I think, have gotten to rely too much on Band-Aids, and we appoint czars or special envoys or administrators when they're duplicative of functions that already exist, but don't seem to be moving as fast as the White House would like, or performing exactly what the White House wants. So my sense is that you need task forces, you need special envoys on occasion, but your first examination ought to be, is there an assistant secretary that already has this responsibility? Is there a competent ambassador on site? Because when you appoint a person with duplicative authority, it can really set things back. It's just confusing. That said, there is going to be a need for these as we go forward, but they ought to be led by the departments and agencies that have the lead stake in the issue and supported by the NSC.
Thank you. Mr. Chalet, you had your hand up. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I very much want to echo what the ambassador has said. Czars have been in the past a good thing, but there's also too much of a good thing. And the czars that both at the State Department or at the White House, that I worked closely with during my time in government, whether going back to the Clinton administration, the czar on the Balkans, or during the Obama administration, the SRAP structure on Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department, were successful, had some challenges, but were successful in trying to bring about greater coordination both within the department as also within the broader interagency. But clearly every administration, I think in the modern era, has seen a proliferation of these czars. And when a new team comes in, we certainly did this in 2008, I expect the next transition team will do the same, is take a close look at these various idiosyncratic bureaucratic structures that administrations create, sometimes for personnel reasons, sometimes because an issue becomes so important that they don't want it to overwhelm the other senior officials who have the whole world to worry about. But I think that we have to be very mindful moving forward that there can be too many of these, and this just create Band-Aids that don't actually get at the core coordination strategic problem that we're all interested in trying to solve.
Ambassador Blumenfield.
Yeah, if I may, my last position in government was as a special envoy. In 2008, I came back part-time on an issue that the chairman knows about. I was to try to travel the world and quietly remove shoulder-fired missiles from circulation. And you had to be able to speak to heads of government, chiefs of defense, because no second in ranking would ever give up a weapon. You have to go to the top. And so I took my orders directly from Steve Hadley and Condoleezza Rice and had a very strong support from the NSC counterterrorism team. My observation, though, and this is a little bit of dirty laundry, is that there are lots of senior people walking the halls of the State Department looking for a job that's at their rank, and that this is a way they want these positions. It's not clear to me they're all necessary. What I would do, and this is probably a little bit out of the ordinary, but I've seen it in the past, is to identify prominent Americans in the private sector and in Congress who could be a well-received envoy to deliver a message to a head of state, somebody of prominence, and I include members of the House and Senate in that list on both sides of the aisle, which would add credibility to the President or the Secretary of State's message. So I hope we think about that and move in that direction.
Thank you. If the chairman will indulge me, I have a quick question that I'd like to ask you, all of you. The current House language in the FY17 NDAA calls for Senate confirmation of the National Security Advisor if the NSC staff exceeds 100 employees, including detailees. I want to quote Stephen Hadley, who was former NSA to President George W. Bush. He said, and I quote him, if a president thought that what he or she shared with the National Security Advisor could be compelled in public testimony, the president would look elsewhere for a national security and foreign policy confidant. That's a quote. So do you think that Senate confirmation, any of you, of the National Security Advisor would inhibit this person from serving the president? And does it also raise questions about the constitutional separation of powers? Anyone care to try it?
I suspect I speak for all of us, but I'll start off, and that is, I don't think advice and consent of the president's, for the president's personal staff makes sense. That said, we're in a situation where the Congress needs to play a larger role and have a larger discussion with the president about how the NSC works and who is selected. Now, that doesn't mean a vote, but I surely wish that you all and the executive office of the president had a more candid or active discussion about who's there and who's serving.
Thank you.
If the gentleman would yield.
Yes, certainly.
From my standpoint, if you look carefully at the language, the intent there seems to me, and it's not our language, it's from the Armed Services Committee, but the intent seems to be to control the size of the staffing and get it back to the original numbers, because the confirmation isn't required as long as the executive branch concurs with evolving back to the original size of the NSC staff. So I don't think the intent is to drive confirmation. I think the intent is to try to exercise some kind of congressional oversight or control over what's actually happened in the agency. So I would just throw that in for the mix. I don't know how else to do that, but this hearing's an attempt. Ambassador Miller?
I think if you look at what we've written, indeed, there is very strong support for limiting the head count at the NSC,
Right.
as it is seen as the root cause of a number of subsets of problems. But there's equally strong opposition to the advice and consent, so I think your observation is bang on.
Yeah, I think it's a clumsy attempt to get at your objective. So our hope is to reach a bipartisan consensus of a more effective way to get to that objective. We go now to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing. From the ransom payments in Iran to the alleged secret Iran deals and humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding every day in Syria, the manipulation of intelligence on ISIS, there are too many examples of how the White House has manipulated information while keeping the Congress and, most importantly, the American people in the dark. And, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for bringing up Cuba in your opening statement, because that's a good example of what was happening with the secretive nature. The White House decided to keep not only Congress in the dark, but also cut out the State Department and others. Even though the White House was negotiating with the Cuban regime for more than a year, then Assistant Secretary Jacobson testified before our committee in February of 2015 that she found out about the negotiations just weeks before the announcement. And when former Deputy National Security Advisor and now Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken testified at his confirmation hearing in November of 2014, he assured the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that any change in U.S. policy toward Cuba would be done in full consultation with Congress. Well, that turned out to be an utter falsehood, as less than a month later, with zero consultation with the Congress, the administration announced what has proven to be a complete failure of a deal with the Castro regime. And as we heard from Ambassador Bloomfield, NSC staffers shouldn't conduct official actions which are supposed to have to be the responsibility of agencies that are answerable to Congress and then expect to be immune from accountability. So, Mr. Cholet, I have a series of questions. We won't have time to answer them, but maybe we can have a discussion afterward. Is it worrisome that NSC is not accountable to Congress, or that when Congress attempts to exercise our oversight authority in the foreign policy realm, it cannot perform that function because NSC officials do not testify before Congress? Also, what steps can Congress make in order to make the NSC more transparent? And there was a time when NSC staffers were trained on their proper roles to delineate between the duties and roles of the NSC and the duties and role of the State Department or Defense Department, making sure that they didn't overlap and instead stayed focused on their responsibility in those lanes and left the policy making to the proper person. And I was wondering if you received that kind of training when you were at the NSC, and do you have any idea if training programs of this type still exist? Also, in November of last year, when I traveled to Afghanistan and our generals on the ground indicated that their hands were tied when it came to operations, no doubt it was because I believe NSC staff were overriding our leaders on the field, and former Defense Secretaries Gates and Panetta both have complained that about NSC staff imposing themselves on their jurisdiction. Based on your experience in both the NSC and various government agencies, maybe you can help shed some light on that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to follow up with you as well if I don't get fully to answer your good questions. First, I'll take it in reverse order on the tension between White House oversight, political oversight, and what's going on in military operations. I experienced that on both sides of the ball, right, at the NSC staff, but then also when I served at the Pentagon as an assistant secretary. And whereas there are examples, and I don't know exactly when the example that the ambassador's report cited about when a junior staffer apparently called the Pentagon to ask for something that was completely out of order. That's not the regular order. That doesn't happen that often, at least in my experience. And when it does happen, it should be stopped, absolutely. And the national security advisors I worked for, the Secretary of Defenses I worked for, would not tolerate that. That said, there is such thing as presidential control over the use of military force. So if the NSC staff, on behalf of the president, is essentially ensuring that the agencies follow the president's prerogative on how that force should be used, what kind of targets we hit, what sort of operations we conduct, it seems to me that that's something we would want. I was struck in 2008, coming into the Obama administration, how intensively the Bush White House, in the Iraq-Afghanistan czar and the directorate that was created to run the surge in Iraq in particular, how deeply involved in military operational issues that team was, much to the distress of uniformed military and the Secretary of Defense at the time, to have a sitting three-star general working in the basement of the West Wing, essentially running the surge in Iraq. So I think that should be the exception. It should not be the rule, which then gets back to the opening question, which was the NSC staff, senior NSC officials engaging in direct foreign engagements. I think there should be as little of that as possible. Throughout our history, we have seen national security advisors take on important missions on behalf of the president that are extremely sensitive and secretive. Henry Kissinger's opening to China.
That's right.
Brzezinski's normalization of China several years later. So but then we've also seen, as the Tower Commission pointed out, very negative examples of that.
Well,
so
thank you.
It should be the exception, not the rule.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm out of time, but thank you for this hearing. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Last century, the high water mark for the NSC was Kissinger. Everything we complain about now was probably more true then in terms of the NSC. As to this century, I have seen this committee and the House of Representatives in general go from foreign policy makers to foreign policy kibitzers that are at least allowed to provide some oversight and some input to really an irrelevancy, because the most important people making and carrying out foreign policy don't even come here and pretend to listen to us. Mr. Chairman, the Armed Services Committee passes an authorization bill every year, and nothing illustrates the importance of that more than that the provision to limit the size of the National Security Council is in their bill and will be considered in their bill, whereas our bill for 15 years is in exercise in, well, often isn't even written, usually isn't even considered by the House, and hasn't reached the President's desk in 15 years. So what we need to do is say, not how can we possibly get the most important presidential advisor on foreign policy to come into this room, but how can we write an authorizing bill in this room that becomes law? And I would like to see us demand that we don't appropriate money for foreign policy that isn't authorized. And we could do that by insisting that the authorizing bill that we pass be joined to the appropriations bill, and that neither the Senate nor the President should be able to get the money without dealing with the authorizing provisions. And if we as a committee would demand that the rule for considering the foreign operations appropriations bill include both the authorizing and the appropriating. I'd like them to be separate bills, but separate bills where one of them is thrown away, that's not the best approach. So if they were married, then when they go over to the Senate, we make it plain. You've got to have an authorizing and an appropriations bill. You go to the President, you say, you want the money, you've got to look at the appropriations. You've got to look at the authorizations as well. Mr. Chalette, I'm going to go into a much less significant point. You compared the NSC staff to the CRS. Is that just the CRS foreign policy, national security folks. That's not their folks on medicine or transportation or whatever.
Fair enough. I used the most expansive numbers both for the NSC staff, so I took the
Right.
maximalist number of them as well as CRS to try to make an apples to apples. So
But you looked only at what portions of CRS?
no. This was the entire thing.
Okay, so
I
you're
just
saying
as I-
that,
just as I
but I
included-
mean, it's like you're comparing apples with a fruit plate.
But, so I included in the NSC staff the back office people. So
Yeah,
all,
but everyone at the NSC staff deals with national security. There are people over at CRS who are dealing with health policy. So the fairer comparison would be the entire White House and the old executive office building and all the offices of the president and all the czars. Because otherwise, you're comparing a department at CRS that deals with health policy, and you don't have anybody at, I hope you don't have anybody at the at the NSC who's focusing on a cure for cancer.
but there are people on health policy.
on
I mean,
health.
not domestic health policy, but global
Right,
health
yeah,
is
global
a huge
health,
issue.
yes,
Absolutely.
okay. Ambassador Miller, were you indicating a desire to say something?
My hope is that you all can take a very serious look at improving the performance of the State Department. I spend most of my life investing capital and looking at the performance of companies. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they aren't, but whatever, you can learn a lot. And state needs to step back. You need to help them step back and say, what do we need to do to make the department work? The Foreign Service is a fine, fine institution. I was immensely well served as a political appointee in 2 embassies, very well served at the NSC. There is more human capability at state going to waste than in almost any institution I've ever seen. Somehow or other, we need to put our minds together to say, how can we fix this? Because if
So you think maybe Congress should oversee the State Department, write an authorization bill, pass it into law, and have an agency of the federal government act according to congressional authorization? That is a brilliant and innovative idea, one that we ought to apply to the State Department, and I yield back.
I've waited all these years for that opportunity. Thank you.
I yield back.
Well, here we are, and it's in my hands. There you go. Listen,
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
all right. Let me just note that I had the privilege of serving in the White House for 7 years, and I had a lot of experience with the NSC, and a lot of experience since then, and during that time with the other agencies of government. So I have more than just having been here on this side of the questioning. Let me suggest this. I think that our government isn't working as effectively as it could and should. I think that targeting the NSC is the wrong target. Having, as I say, been experience with all of these players, it's not the NSC that's the problem. Problem is we got a bloated State Department and a bloated intelligence community. I mean, after 9/11, what did we do? We made the intelligence community even more complicated. Put even another layer of bureaucracy between the president and his intelligence sources. That's what we did in Congress. No, and the fact is the National Security Council was established so that the President of the United States would have people on his staff who could keep up on the issues of the day. And now there's a debate whether or not the NSC is overstepping its bounds when the President actually engages in foreign policy activities that I guess the Congress or other people or the State Department feels they should be conducting. Let us note that Kissinger made a dramatic difference in the history of this country when at the height of the Cold War, when it was going against us, it looked like the United States was going down, that he changed the whole dynamics by reaching out to China. And that happened secretly. I believe if they tried to do it through the State Department, that initiative never would have succeeded. That would have been undercut and every step of the way, not to mention what would happen if the CIA and everybody else was involved in it. Let me note also that the bad use of the NSC, what has been Ambassador Bloomfield has mentioned, was the Iran-Contra affair. Quite frankly, we'd given the Contras $100 million the year before to the CIA, and then all of a sudden we're going to cut them off. There's a lot of politics being played on that culminated in, instead of letting those guys go, Ollie North took it upon himself to make sure they got money for ammunition, et cetera. So I don't think that's an example of how things go haywire. I think, in fact, the Iran-Contra affair demonstrated that the President of the United States has to be a player in these things and has to have a staff that's able to be a player. Ollie North also, I might add, when he was there, took it upon himself to reposition a carrier battle group so that when the Achille Laurel was taken over, that we would have airplanes that could actually intercept the terrorists when they were captured, if you remember that. Now, I don't know if we would have gone through the normal channels, whether that carrier battleship force, but they at least paid attention when Ollie North called up the Admiral and said that would be a good place to put him there in case of emergency. One personal example as well, I remember I've been deeply involved in the Afghan thing since I was a speechwriter. What's a speechwriter doing involved in helping the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, but that's the way it was. And there was a situation where a general called me and said, look, we have to take off at we have to take on within a matter of days, or there's a field hospital that will not go to the Mujahideen on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And these are men who are put their lives on the line for us, and the Pakistanis are demanding money for our planes to land, and our planes aren't going to land, and thus hundreds of Mujahideen are going to die because we don't have this field hospital that is in the back of a C-130 waiting to go there. Can you do something? Now, if I had to, at that time, I'm a member of the President's staff, I'm a special assistant to the President of the United States. Well, if I had to go call up somebody over at the State Department, the CIA, or the Defense Department, it would not have gotten done. I know that. Hundreds of people fighting for us against the Soviet Army would have been dead. And I called up a guy at NSC. He said, well, we can't do this on our own. I can't do this. And I said, look, all I want you to do is take a call, give a call to our embassy in Pakistan, and they will then tell the Pakistani government that the White House is called, and the job will get done. Oh, I can't do that on my own. You know what? He called back and says, okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. Because I told him, I said, okay, hundreds of people will die who are our best allies in the fight against the Soviet Union, and they'll die because you're not willing to make one call. He calls me, he says, okay, I'll do it. And you know what? One call, and that hospital equipment got there, and hundreds of lives were saved. We need to have a National Security Council that can function, that can do that can save the lives of those hundreds of thousands of Mujahideen fighters or whoever it is who's in jeopardy around the world. And I think that we need, does the NSC is involved in crisis management? Okay, the President needs a staff to be there during a crisis. Does the President need someone for policy analysis so that he's not getting hundreds of reports from different points of view? Let somebody be there who can digest it over a matter of days rather than an hour when the President has to make a decision. No, we need that. And I think that the NSC should not be decreased, and instead we should try to make the rest of government more efficient. And that's where things are breaking down. Please feel free to comment on anything I just said right down the line. Ambassador Miller.
On the intel situation, I could not agree more. For my 2 years at the White House, I ran the Counterterrorism Coordination weekly meeting, the CSG. Lincoln and I got to meet each other then. Counterterrorism requires a very tight turning radius, and that means speed of movement and trust of communicators. You can't do that among large bureaucratic structures, I don't think. Eventually, it gets down to, does the J3 trust you? Does the head of counterterrorism at the CIA trust you? Do your principals trust you as the first line actors? And if they don't, you can lose that advantage of information, which may be stale in 2 or 3 days, and you've got to move. On your ability to call, let's suppose you need to call the J3. The problem with a very, very large White House staff is that senior officers at the Pentagon don't get to know the White House staff, and they don't really know who's phoning. And you get more stories about the White House called.
Yeah.
456-1414 is not a self-dialing machine. But, you know,
Well, Ollie did make telephone calls.
listen, I followed Ollie on, and Ollie and I traded notes on a lot of stuff. I got to know the J3 well enough, General Scowcroft and Secretary Gates way back then. We all trusted each other. And you could pick up the phone and you could call then Admiral Owens, who was Secretary Gates' military aide, and say, Bill, we have a problem and we have to do something in a hurry. Now, Bill knew who I was. If you don't have that trust, things don't work right. And that's one of the problems with having a larger staff. If the larger staff stays inside and does analytic work, that's fine. But if you're a special assistant, somebody at the Pentagon better know who you are when you pick up the phone and say, let's move a carrier task group.
Right.
That's a serious decision.
All right, well, thank you. And real quickly, I'm sorry I blabbed on with too much time
my
here,
fault.
but if you very quickly, if you have some disagreement, please feel free.
Congressman Rohrbacher, I just want to reiterate the importance of the structure of government that has worked so well. The NSC staff should be up to the President. The President should have whatever staff the President is comfortable with, he or she, so long as the staff does not do things which would more properly be under the purview of both the American people's right to have oversight and the congressional oversight and the authorized activities. As long as they're coordinating and operating under the 1947 mandate, they can have as many people as they want, whatever makes the President comfortable. But that line should not be crossed. The second thing I need to say, Derek has been an Assistant Secretary of Defense. I was in ISA for 8 years at the Pentagon. The National Command Authority is sacrosanct. There's a famous story in the Nixon administration when Dr. Kissinger called Secretary of Defense Laird and said, the President wants such and such to be done. And he said, well, let the President call, click. And that's the National Command Authority.
Whoa.
If there are lives on the line and exigencies, if you haven't pre-delegated the authority to the people who are capable of doing the right thing, whether it's the State Department in a Benghazi situation or the Pentagon in a military situation in the field, then that's a failure of policy. But it's fixable. We just simply need to recognize these are the things that have made America work so well in the past. We just simply need to recognize the lines and execute properly.
Shall it?
And I know you're out of time, so I'll be very brief. I fully agree with what both of my colleagues here have said. I just want to echo, sir, your point, which is, in many ways, the growth of the NSC does reflect the growing complexity and size of our national security apparatus, and that there are entire dimensions of policy that didn't exist 25 years ago that now the President needs to fully understand. He needs to have folks around him who fully understand. And so that explains a lot of the growth. I think the NSC is too big. I think it can be smaller, and I think the trend, as I said, is headed in the right direction, but I don't think we should have an arbitrary cap on it.
I don't ever remember getting a briefing on the threat of cyber attack back during the Reagan years. Mr. Series, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's all right that you went over a little bit. First of all, this is a very informative hearing. I want to thank you for being here. You know, on one side we have experience, on one side we have youth that's worked, and Ambassador Bloomfield, you're in the middle somewhere as far as, but it's been very informative. And from my, from what I gathered, I would tend to think that the NSC is just too large. I have problems thinking that a staffer can call a four-star general and say, do this. To me, that is, I guess I've been involved in politics a long time, and it's not your enemies who get you in trouble, but your friends, or people that work for you. And I think that is a very possible scenario when it's happened. But as it gets larger, I think it's even more of something that can happen, and I have a problem with that. I have a problem with the NSC negotiating. Negotiated secretly. We had here people from the State Department, and we asked them about certain negotiations, especially with Cuba. And I don't know if they wanted to lie or not, but we were told that they weren't negotiating, when in reality there was negotiations going on. And I would think that if they are negotiated secretly, and you have a State Department person coming before this committee, and you ask them the question, and she'll say, no, they weren't. I would think that, I would take it at her word that she didn't know that secretly somebody was negotiating. And to me, that's a problem. You know, we have a State Department with very capable people who are capable of doing the kind of work that some people at the NSC is doing. I also think that sometimes this committee, the NSC, is used as a buffer. This is to keep people away from reaching maybe the presidency, or the president using the committee to keep other people away. There's got to be somebody in between, so to absolve any responsibility. So I really don't think that keep growing this committee is going to be helpful to this country, or it's going to be helpful to the president. I think that, as Mr. Ambassador Miller expressed, there are many capable people working in different places in the State Department where they're tripping over each other to do something. And they could do some of the work instead of growing this committee. And can you just tell me where you think it started to go wrong, this committee? This NSC committee, where did it go? Did you see it that it started going wrong with your experience? Where did it take the wrong direction?
Yeah,
Let me put it this way.
A very inelegant answer is that apparently over time, within the 18 acres at the White House, a sense that speed of movement was critical. And that goes way back, if you look at the graphs here, it goes way back to the Clinton administration, which you saw a first very big spike in NSC staff. The illusion from my standpoint is that speed of movement is more important than wise decision-making. Wise decision-making is frequently slow and difficult, and there are many times in which speed of movement is the most important issue that you're looking at. But it's become an excuse, I think, for not involving institutions that seem to move too slowly, that have a lot of wisdom and experience. This study began more than 2 years ago when I called some of my agency friends who had been involved in the Afghan situation, and I said, really, nobody talked to you about what we were doing in the Middle East? And the answer was, no, nobody talked to us. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. So I don't have an elegant answer to that. But I think one thing is that the White House has pushed on an open door. The Congress has allowed this to occur, and it's not healthy for the Congress, and it's not healthy for the White House either.
Congressman, could I just say that I think this suggests a larger solution. I know people have specific complaints about the NSC staff, probably on both administrations, Republican and Democratic. Part of it is not their fault. because with the tools of information they have, with the real-time media contact, with ambassadors coming and calling at the White House as well as the State Department and possibly visiting military dignitaries, the question arises of what can the State Department do that the NSC staff can't do? There's a little bit of we can do it all here. And part of it is because of technology and just the press of business. So I think without blaming people, we can look at that and say, what can we do? Because if it goes much further, it does cross the line where there's no oversight, and Congress can't call them before, they can't confirm the appointees, and the president should not want that to happen. So there needs to be a conversation. I personally think that Congress has immense power over the next president that could be a subject of discussion during the transition and before knowing the result of the election, that has to do partly in the Senate with the confirmation process, partly with the amount of hearings and questions for the record. These are things which are enormous burdens on an incoming administration. If their appointees are going to be slow to be confirmed, if they're going to get thousands of questions that the bureaucracy will be tied up answering, you have something to bargain with. And this might be, Congressman Engel had brought up the question of an authorization bill. I'd like to see a grand bargain where there are fewer high officials in the executive branch, and frankly, maybe a few fewer gavels in the Congress, so that we can get back to a leaner, high-level, principle to principles. My congressman's yelling at me. I'll stop.
Thank you very much.
My friend just yielded for one quick observation.
Sure.
Because I want to return to this when it's my turn. Ambassador Bloomfield, excellent point, but I want to make one point. The change up here with respect to the NSC came out of the military, not the State Department. And that causes me grave concern about the dismissal of young Turks calling a 4-star and daring to ask or tell something. That's not a good enough reason to revamp the entire national security apparatus of the President of the United States, which I think my friend Mr. Werbacher was making as well. So I want to engage in that when it's my turn, but I think it's important to remember the genesis of the proposed change in the legislation. It didn't come out of the foreign policy community on the Hill. It came out of the armed services community. And I yield back.
Well, if I may, Congressman Connolly, I never thought of myself as an old codger, but I know a lot of 4-stars, retired and some active duty, and it's been my privilege to know them. And I've seen them during situations where they might even not take the guidance from the Secretary of Defense on certain things like ROE in a situation where they need to keep the peace the first day of an intervention. I know these folks, and I've been there. Derek will have his own experience. It's unfathomable to me that a 4-star commander in the field would take guidance from a staffer in the bureaucracy. It's unfathomable to me. I don't understand it.
Just very briefly, I agree with that. And again, my experience is that that's a rare occurrence where there's a junior staffer who tries to call a 4-star, or a lieutenant colonel working in the NSC who calls a admiral to move a carrier battle group. It's an exception and not the rule. Just one very quick observation on this question of oversight. When I served at the White House, I always found myself toggling back and forth between two perspectives. One is, why aren't the agencies doing what the president has decided? So he decided to do something, why isn't this happening, or why is it happening too slowly? Or it was, what are they doing? The president hasn't decided yet. They're creating facts on the ground before the president's been able to actually make a decision on what he wants to do. And I never found a way out of that dilemma personally. And so I do think that there is a sort of secular trend towards greater oversight because, of course, that's the common answer for both. You hold more meetings, you do more taskings, you try to hold agencies accountable. And I think in some ways it goes back to this issue of we ultimately do hold the president accountable. When things go wrong, the president is blamed. When things go right, the president gets credit. And so the NSC staff as an extension of the president tends to be more involved in the policy.
Well, thank you very much. And that means that the president has to be accountable for what his appointees do, or her. There you go. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks for all of you for being here. It's a fascinating conversation, minute by minute. It leads to new questions, at least on my behalf, and I think about the most recent one on accountability of the president. And
you know, I hate to bring up the sore subject of Ben Rhodes, but I don't see any accountability. I mean, I see Ben Rhodes on the TV from Laos this week, and I myself wrote the president a letter asking him to relieve Ben Rhodes for his forays that were made public. That having been said, I know the 1947 Act doesn't specifically talk about qualifications, but you fine gentlemen who've worked in the industry maybe could lead us in the right direction. And I would also say right here that I'm not an advocate of Congress meddling too much in the president's business, and I think that regardless of the president's party or who that person is that everybody wants the president to have the tools that he or she needs to complete the mission. But it's apparent, I think, to most people that this thing is pretty broken for whatever reason, and without any congressional oversight, we're completely relying on the executive to make the correct decisions, and once it gets a level or two below him, it seems, or her, it seems like it's the rules are being made up as they go for the expedience of whatever at the moment is the is garnering the attention. So with that in mind, what should I looked at Ben Rhodes's qualifications, knowing what he was involved in, the level. This is national security. This is national policy that affects millions of lives and the world. And I think that the qualifications for that individual have to be profound and robust, in my opinion. I mean, I don't have the qualifications to do what some of these folks are doing, and I wouldn't deign to think that I do. What should they be? And how does that come about? Anybody?
If I could give a perspective, Congressman Perry, I can't answer about individuals in the current administration, but it's been my observation, and I made this in my testimony, that because the agencies in the national security space are so bloated with so many empowered people doing you name it. There's 80 direct reports to the Secretary of State by my count. That's just an unbelievable fact. And I would say OSD, OJCS, and as Congressman Rohrbacher pointed out, the intel community with 800 new billets layered on top of the 16 agencies. So that's out there. Now you have the NSC staff, which has grown into several hundred. And if you could just imagine, and we all can try to imagine the president inside the Oval Office saying, who are all these people? You're getting huge amounts of paperwork from all of these agencies. Then you've got hundreds of people that you met once when they came in to say hello and take your picture. No wonder, I sort of can understand why he'd take 5 people that he trusts and say, close the door, we'll figure it out. Sort of a treehouse mentality. I don't mean to be diminished.
And I would agree with you.
It's just it's a process problem.
My perception in years past is that it was 4, 5, 10 people that the president trusted, and that's who the NSC was now. It's apparent now that that's who the current president trusts, and I don't blame him. But who are all these other people, and why do we need them? What have they got to do with anything? Let me just. What is the NSC's? What are the responsibilities regarding the national security strategy? Anybody?
Sure. And Congressman, I served for a year and a half as the Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the White House in terms of the creation of the National Security Strategy of the United States, which happens once every 3 years or so.
But you know what the statute is, don't you?
Yeah. No.
So in 8 years now, we'll have it done twice when it's required every single year.
Sure, and administrations, I mean, unfortunately, as someone who owned the strategic planning operation or ran it, I would have wanted to see it done more often, but it's traditionally been done going back to when the statute was created, I think twice in an administration. Bush did it twice, I think Clinton did it twice. Actually did it more than twice. But
so do we need a change in the standard? Since apparently we can't abide by the standard,
No,
or
I
refuse to? What are the
believe-
consequences of not abiding by the
As I-
standard? Poor policy,
Yeah,
right? Poor
I
execution.
believe there should be more strategic thinking in the White House. I very much applaud that recommendation, the Atlantic Council's report. As I said, we tried mightily to give our senior policymakers more time to think strategically and get out of the inbox. But the press of events has been unrelenting. And just very quickly, if I could, sir.
So do you have hold that thought for a minute and then continue it afterward, but do you have a recommendation regarding to me, one of the bigger issues is we have all these new people, all these great minds. We can't even get a national security strategy out. How does the national military strategy follow no national security strategy? How does anybody know what the plan is?
I think one of the most important things that a new administration can do is to try to get the sequencing right and how they do these strategies, because no administration has gotten it right, where you start with a national security strategy, then you do the QDR, then you do the QDDR, and then you do all the other sort of agency-level strategies. And unfortunately, because of different oversight committees, different processes in the different departments, those are not well aligned, and it doesn't make much sense. I concede that. Can I just say very briefly, because not to get into individuals, but I should, Ben Rhodes is a friend and colleague. I worked with him very closely during my time in the administration. He's one of the most talented people I've worked with in Washington. I've worked here for 20 years with a lot of talented people. That said, both the DoD, state, and at the NSC, there were a lot of folks that I worked with who were the best in the business, and there were a lot of folks I worked with, or some, I should say, that I worked with, and I wondered how they got there. This goes back to a question that I was given earlier that I didn't get a chance to answer, which was there isn't really any quality training done really in any of the positions in the national security field. Basically, once you get out of school, or if you're in the career foreign service or in the military, you get a chance to do a stint at NDU. I think that's something we should take very seriously. I believe in past authorization bills for the State Department, that issue has been looked at, sort of career professional training. But to ensure that we do have a higher standard in all of our agencies for senior officials.
Let me just conclude with this, Mr. Chairman. Regardless of Ben Rhodes' talents, and I acknowledge he seems like a very talented individual, but what I've read and what I've seen, nothing at all regarding his talent explains or justifies deceiving the American people outwardly, regardless of the policy outcome. The ends do not justify the means, and I find it reprehensible, unacceptable, and I think it's a black mark on the administration and on American policy, and that's my opinion. But with that, I yield back.
Thank you. He ended it on a different kind of note. That's fine. But Ms. Bass, you may begin it on any kind of note that you'd like.
Well, thanks for letting us know how you really feel. Thank you very much for your testimony. I think this has been a very, very, very interesting discussion. And I just wanted to ask a few questions. One, as I listened to the three of you, and I want you to tell me whether I'm right or wrong, there's things that need to be improved in the NSC, but I don't think I heard any of you say that we're in some kind of crisis and that there's something terribly wrong. I guess listening to whether we should increase or decrease the staff, what worries me about that is that it seems rather mechanical. And I can absolutely appreciate what you were saying, Mr. Collette, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about how things have changed so much, especially from Bloomfield, you know, what you were saying. Mr. Collette, you mentioned climate change, and I was wondering how cybersecurity, I certainly understand, but I was wondering if you could give me an example of how climate change, you know, fits in there. But if each of you could respond to, we are not in a crisis, there's things that could be improved, but there's no great disaster happening. Am I correct in what I hear?
I'll take the first shot if I could. I agree with you. I don't think it's a crisis, but I think it's legitimate and good that this committee, the Congress, the strategic community, those of us on the outside now are looking into this issue, because we have an opportunity here coming up with a new president taking office to reform the NSC, to try to right-size it, to try to ensure that we're getting the most we can out of it, and to help the incoming administration think about these important issues that they're going to be inheriting, because the NSC is very malleable. I mean, the only thing in statute is the members of the actual NSC, the senior level members, and establishing the executive secretary. Everything else, the president can do things totally differently. And so climate change is a perfect example where that's an issue that didn't exist much 25 years ago. And now, of course, it's been a major issue internationally and a major priority for this administration. So although it's an issue set that doesn't solely reside in the NSC, because there are other agencies within the Executive Office of the President that deal with various issues of climate change, clearly the effort of the United States government to try to get at this issue, both in terms of how we behave here at home, but also how we negotiate abroad, is something the NSC has had to follow as the President's been engaging in international diplomacy on this issue.
Oh, so it's because he's been engaging in international diplomacy.
Both. I mean, it's a priority. I mean, this is one of the greatest
I just didn't see, I mean, believe me, I understand the significance of climate change. I just didn't see
Can I just take a moment?
its relation here.
Congresswoman Bass, I'll be the one that says crisis is too strong a word, but the bus only shows up every 4 years before an election when you can think a little bit out of the in-basket and say, what should we be fixing? I think we have something verging on a crisis in our national security community, and it's not personal to President Obama or any of the members of his team who've been named today. It's broader than that, and it's more historic. There's a foreign diplomat in Asia who made a comment a few years ago that's true. He said when he deals with other governments, they take 20% of the time figuring out their policy and 80% implementing it. But in Washington, it's reversed.
Yeah.
And I have spent much of my life watching the internecine battles between people trying to hang on to their authority, their issue. I'll give you one example. My old bureau, the Political Military Bureau, went into Libya after Gaddafi was taken down to look for loose weapons and shoulder-fired missiles and arms with UN folks. Then came Syria. And I remember Congressman Royce held a hearing on Syria chemical weapons, but because chemical weapons are WMD, that's a different bureau. We had teams on the ground, operational, with communications, ready to go, but a different bureau said, no, that's my turf. And that's just one of 1,000, I use the term 1,000 bowls of rice in my testimony, and I see that, and I think we need to address it.
Okay.
Very quickly, Ms. Bass, I think crisis is the wrong term, but it's close. Crises today seem to be defined by what's on the right-hand column of the Washington Post front page, whatever. We're in a significant crisis in terms of the stature of the United States in the world. Full stop. If you're traveling out there, you're going to get an earful. If you're an old ambassador, you're used to being criticized, but it's getting worse, and we need to step back and take a serious look about how our country is developing international strategy, and as Link was saying, then how we implement. Much of our report focuses on the fact that there may have been reasonable strategic decisions made, but the implementation was poor enough to jeopardize the outcome. And I think that's a very serious issue. And one last observation, and that is, one of the things that you're observing is the White House is trying to solve many, many, many problems. There is not a staff at the White House of the size to solve all the problems that really fall under the jurisdiction of cabinet secretaries and agency heads. And so I think one of the things that we need to look at is the proper use of the cabinet officials and the agency heads to say the president cares a great deal about X, and he wants you, Madam Secretary, to go do that, not to add another layer of people at the White House.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think that there are probably too many people in the NSC. I think there are too many people in a lot of parts of government. But to me, it's the authority that they're exercising that's more important than the sheer numbers. In other words, if I had to choose between a bloated staff that was basically serving the core advisory function versus a leaner staff that was actually usurping the authorities of the secretaries, I would choose the former. And I think, are most of you in agreement with that? I know Ambassador Bloomfield. And part of the reason is, I think when you have the model gravitating towards there's more policy being implemented by the NSC, it really detracts from the accountability that the American people have. I mean, for example, Ambassador Bloomfield, I saw you served in different positions. You had to get confirmed by the Senate for those positions? Yes. And those were deputy assistant posts in the State Department?
Assistant Secretary and above.
Right. At the NSC, for example, we mentioned Ben Rhodes as the deputy. He did not have to get confirmed by the Senate, correct? And he's been described as the most influential voice shaping U.S. foreign policy other than President Obama himself. And so I think that somebody who's really wielding that much influence in our affairs of state should at least have to sit and get Senate confirmation. And if Rhodes is an advisor to the president, that's what he's doing, fine. But if he's implementing policy, if he's crafting things with the Iran deal with Cuba, that becomes much different. And Ben Rhodes, and I appreciate your comments about him. Obviously, we've had disagreements with him because of how the Iran deal has been handled. We wanted to invite him to testify, but he's a member of the staff, and so he doesn't come. He would not have been able to be confirmed to be Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. So you're putting people who are implementing policy without having the check of Senate confirmation. And again, if they're White House advisors, I don't want us dragging in an actual counselor to the president. I think that there are absolutely legitimate separation of powers concerns there. But then you also have this idea of putting the power in the hands of the NSC staff. Then you don't have congressional oversight, which is what we need to do. Secretary Kerry has to come here because Congress controls the budget. Secretary of Defense has to come here, and they have to answer questions about how the policy is being conducted. That's good for Congress, but it's also good for the American people to be able to see what's going on. As I mentioned, we wanted to figure out how this Iran deal happened. We invited Ben Rhodes, and he declined to come, and I think his position as it should be, I think that would be legitimate, but I think he was exercising authority that went beyond that. And then I guess the final thing that I think about, when you have people on the NSC staff getting involved with military commanders in the field, totally going outside the normal chain of command. If we had military commanders that buck the chain of command, they would never be able to get away with that. I mean, that would be a cardinal sin to do it. And so we have a very clear chain of command. When you have a combatant commander, they're reporting up to the Secretary of Defense and then to the President. It should be, you know, we can't have the NSC staff just basically going a whole end run around the chain of command. Ambassador Miller, you wanted to...
Yeah, just very quickly on that, at least one of our intelligence agencies has handled the communications issue by basically saying no calls to staff in the field from the White House will be answered, full stop. Those calls will be referred to a headquarters across the river, and we will worry about responding to staff. We got, in our interviews, we got really, really tough commentary from the military. You all know General Mattis and a wonderful group, virtually all from the Naval Service, who felt very strongly about that. One other just one comment on confirmation. I obviously went through the confirmation process in the ambassadorial assignments, and I found it very valuable. I learned a lot. An ambassador represents not just the president, but the country. So I think a dialogue with the Congress is actually very helpful. And when I was at the NSC, I was immensely comfortable coming up here to discuss issues where I knew members had concerns, and nobody had to ask me to testify. I was happy to come up and talk. And I think that the end of my testimony speaks to that, and that is you can't legislate trust. You can't change organizations to create trust. You have to just begin to work with each other to the point that you say, yeah, these are all pretty bright guys, and they all care about the country. And I hope that's where we might begin to move here. I'm sorry I took so long with that.
That's okay. My time's expired, but I appreciate all you guys coming and testifying, and I think that there's probably a consensus that this is not operating the precise way it was envisioned, and you know, we'd like to see some changes with the next administration. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. DeSantos. Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will inform my friend from Florida, I don't know that we all agree. I certainly don't agree with his analysis in terms of the prescription. Frankly, how Congress is approaching this through the Armed Services Committee, not through the Foreign Affairs or Foreign Relations Committees, reminds me of H.L. Mencken. You know, for every human problem, there's a solution. There is a solution. Simple, neat, and wrong. Why do we have, I mean, I heard my friend Mr. Perry talk about, well, maybe that old system of 10 advisors is what we ought to go back to. Well, I mean, if you're worried about unwieldy bureaucracies in the White House, let's go back to Lincoln's model. He had 2 secretaries. Would that work? That would certainly not be unwieldy. I don't know that it would. And he had to deal with the Civil War, so what's wrong with that? It's a big, difficult, complex world. Ambassador Miller, you mentioned one of the prescriptions was make the State Department work. I thought that was a profound statement.
Yes.
One of the reasons a president turns to a group of advisors is because the bureaucracy doesn't work for him.
I know.
Thank God there were low-level people telling the president a different thing than Curtis LeMay during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'd followed the chain of command strictly, rigidly. After all, he's got the stars, he's been confirmed. We would have gone to World War III. Curtis LeMay wanted to bomb Cuba, even though he didn't even know that, in fact, some of the missiles, in fact, had already been nuclear tipped and were activated. Thank God there were other voices than the chain of command. There are times the bureaucracy, and I don't mean that in any pejorative way, produces great statesmen and stateswomen, and thank God it does. The very best rises to the top. There are other times that's not so true. And the president has to rely on a group of younger people to give him some advice, and soon, maybe her. And so it seems to me a little thing up here. Congress doesn't do nuance. And so if you look at the legislation, what does it do? What's our fix for this vague problem? It's too big. Well, I don't know. What would make you happy? What would be the ideal Goldilocks solution for the NSC size? And by the way, why have we chosen the NSC? Mr. Charlotte, you mentioned, would you remind us how big the staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon is?
It's roughly 7 times larger than the current NSC.
7 times, and no one's talking about that. Is that a problem? When you were in the White House, was that ever a problem?
They had more charts than we did.
Was there ever confusion as to who was speaking for whom?
No.
Well, I think we need to tread lightly. I don't think that the legislation only ought to have the imprint of the Armed Services Committee. I think it needs some foreign policy overlay, and I think we need to understand what problem it is we're fixing. It may be that it's too big and too unwieldy and not coordinated, and some people overstep their lines. Of course that's going to happen. But does that merit draconian legislation that says you can only have 100? How many are on the NSC staff now, Mr. Charlotte?
It's about 190 policy staff.
Okay, so we're roughly cutting it in half. And if you want to go above that, as the chairman indicated, NSC gets confirmed. Now, this is why I cited Mencken. Let's assume for a minute, stipulate there is a problem, and that's the problem. The solution guarantees all the things you don't like, guarantees institutional friction until the cows come home, because now I'm your equal. I'm confirmed too. And I got actually status, official status, to give you a lot of trouble over there at the State Department or the Pentagon, because I'm confirmed, like you are. And I'm not sure that's the solution. You know, if there was someone who understood that, it was the guy who probably started all this problem, Henry Kissinger. Because when he finally got the confirmable job, he kept the NSC job too, because he didn't want that tension. And that's an interesting model for us to contemplate. Anyway, I'm sorry, but the chairman was gracious, said I could have an extra minute or two to compensate for Mr. Rohrbacher, so this is your comment.
Could I just put another idea before you? And this is in the spirit of nonpartisanship. Every time there's an election, the winning team has a plum book and gives away political appointments. I've been in a political appointed position for 5 administrations. We've watched over the decades as lower and lower levels of the bureaucracy are awarded to political appointees, people who were loyal, who were helpful on a campaign, that sort of thing, who may have been contributors. And I think that we could look at that issue and ask, because as Mr. Perry brought up the question of qualifications, it may be that there's just too many jobs in the foreign policy bureaucracy being awarded to people who had talents in the political arena but really didn't have background or any seasoning in the foreign policy and national security arena. And that's something that would be a bipartisan endeavor. So I thought I would put that out there as part of the record of the hearing.
Mr. Conley, I think it's time for a nuanced look at the State Department.
And I reiterate, that's not us.
Yeah, but somebody up here has got to have a nuanced approach to the State Department. It is an institution, and I'll say this again, every Foreign Service officer that came out of the White House worked for me, they were superb. You put them back in the State Department, and they're put back into a structure that doesn't function well. The cure, if you will, is complex. It's a problem that's grown over many years. And I would hope that a group of staff people up here could begin under your direction to say, what all might we consider as a new administration arrives to make the department work better? If it doesn't, you're not going to solve whatever NSC problem you think you're facing.
Just one brief comment, and I think this is why this hearing is so important, because it creates the space for a new administration to perhaps make some change. I can speak personally from the transition from Bush to Obama, where we also came in with some big ideas about how the NSC should work better. The NSC was way too big under President Bush, and we should make it slimmer and hold the agencies accountable. But then once in office, there was also an imperative: don't screw up. Don't change things for the sake of changing things before you actually know what you're doing, particularly when we're a nation at war. And this gets back to holding the president accountable. I mean, we want the president should be held accountable. The president's the one who got elected. But at the same time, in order to help the president make the system work as best as she or he can, there also needs to be a sense that there's space should be allowed to make those important decisions and perhaps absorb some risk. Because that's part of the issue is presidents, national security advisors don't want to take the risk. If I cut the staff too much and take away that oversight and that accountability that I'm trying to achieve here to serve the president, then we're going to get burned on the other end if something goes wrong.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you for the indulgence, and I think our witnesses are great. And I really think this is a great contribution to a very important subject, and I would hope that our committee will weigh in and not cede this entirely to the Armed Services Committee, because I think it's just too important. And again, I thank you so much for holding this.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Connolly, and I do think we may have stretched a point with Mr. Bloomfield's opinions on the bureaucracy at the size of the Pentagon. Based on his writings, I suspect he's every bit as much concerned with the size of the bureaucracy there as he is with the size of the NSC. I would just make a point that there seems to be no disagreement among those that have worked at the NSC that the current size increases dysfunction. There does seem to be that conclusion. Reducing its size can only help, and it's good that the administration is moving in that direction, but I do want to also express my appreciation for the time of our witnesses today. This has been, I think, as I share Mr. Connolly's view, that this should be the purview of this committee. This has been a very informative hearing. We've had good participation today from the members. As Ambassador Miller said, the NSC is the heart of the foreign policy machine, and I took that analogy to heart. But your other point is that there can be heart failure, and then we have a massive problem. And I think the next administration's goal should be getting back to the core function of the NSC, and that's coordinating policy. Coordinating policy where the diplomats are doing the diplomacy, and the military has oversight over the military, and the NSC can give the president the policy options that it's intended to. And if not, then Congress has to step in, and that's especially true when it comes to accountability. So that is our role, and I thank our witnesses again, and Mr. Connolly, thank you. We stand adjourned.
Thanks, Derek. Well done.
We caught up.
Thank you. Well done.
Well done. Thank you very much.
Hi, Tom. Nice to see you. Hope that was okay from your standpoint. I think, back to Mr. DeSantis' question, I think it was, where did it go wrong? I think when they opened the new executive office building, they suddenly had floodgates of lots of people could be there. But why wouldn't you just call the climate change people from, the energy department and the State Department, say, get over here? So, I mean, we are getting into duplication of effort. And I'd love to see a grand bargain conversation among principals, Senate, House, incoming transition team. And try something radical. That would be